Welcome to Dialogue. As leaders of some 20 economies around the Asia-Pacific region are gathering in San Francisco, economic growth or how to ensure a long-term growth has become the focus of the meeting. Closely related to that topic is the upcoming summit between Chinese President Xi Jinping and his U.S. counterpart Joe Biden. What can we expect out of San Francisco? How does U.S. strategic competition affect the economic performance in the region? Are we going to see the relationship between Beijing and Washington stabilize or even improved after the summit? With these questions in mind, I'm glad to be joined by Dr. Shao Yuqun, Senior Research Fellow at the Shanghai Institute of International Studies, Wang Dan, Chief Economist at Hang Seng Bank, and Stein, Chairman of the American Chamber of Commerce in Shanghai, and Anthony Chan, former Chief Economist at JPMorgan Chase. That's our topic. I'm Xu Qingduo. Welcome to Dialogue. Dr. Shao Yuqun, I will start with you. Brief us, what is APEC and what is the role of APEC in today's world?
Qingduo, first of all, thank you for having me. APEC is a very important regional economic cooperation organization. It's a kind of a platform for the regional countries' economies to come together to talk about the regional economic integration and cooperation. So every year we will see those leaders of the economies coming together, talk about the rules, the interests, the relevant issues that they're interested in. But this time I think APEC is, comparatively speaking, less important. Most of the people are watching closely. They're following with the summit between President Xi Jinping and President Biden.
Mm-hmm. Anthony, you are in the States, so what do you think would be the top priority for the economies on the Pacific Rim for the gathering?
I think that the primary goal is to try to make the relations between the two largest economies in the world, namely the United States and China, to improve. I think President Xi said it best when he told a congressional delegation that there are 1,000 reasons to make U.S. and China relations better and no reasons to make it worse. So that, I think, is going to frame the meeting to try to improve those relations. Because as they always say, when two large elephants fight, the other smaller ants get hurt. And so these 21 member economies certainly depend on these two large economies to improve their relations.
Well, China-U.S. relationship, we certainly will touch upon that. But before that, Wang Dan, we know, if you look back a little bit, it used to be the theme, this long-term theme of free trade and globalization for the Asia-Pacific economic cooperation leaders. In 2016, for example, Chinese President Xi Jinping and the then U.S. leader Barack Obama, they endorsed a shared vision of a free trade area of the Asia-Pacific, a region-wide free trade agreement. So that would include basically every APEC members, including both China and the United States. Where are we now, given what happened over the past years?
Well, China-U.S. competition had really intensified after 2016, and we have seen the peak of the trade tension around 2018. Ever since then, the China-U.S. trade had been declining. But when you look at the details, the picture is rather different because although China and the U.S. are caught in the middle, actually the broader Asian area benefited from this competition. We've seen the industrial relocation away from China to ASEAN countries, some to India, and the investment is more diversified into the third world countries, mostly in Africa and Latin America. So for China and the U.S., the competition will continue no matter what. It is just what in this transition can happen to other middle-sized countries and smaller countries. And that's something the big two powers need to really consider.
But do you see, other people would say because of the tension or the rising tension between China and the U.S., the two largest economies, many countries in the middle, they are, caught in the middle, and sometimes they face a pressure maybe, to choose side. Do you think the tensions may have some, I would say, positive side effect? Do you also see the negative effect probably because of the competition there?
Oh, for sure. For the business world, we look at things from the cost perspective. And when there's big tension between two large economies like the US and China, the cost associated with geopolitical competition has so much increased in doing business in China. So now we see two different trends. Global companies either are aiming to be in China for China, producing things targeting the Chinese market, or they want to strip their Chinese identity. Even for some domestic Chinese companies, they have to be in disguise, trying to pretend they're not Chinese companies in order to really do business in Europe and America. And this trend has created this parallel system that has divided the data, divided the economic system, make the globalization less globalized. And that is not a positive trend for the economy in the long term.
Sean, you are in the business. I guess you tend to agree with Wang Dan, but also if you look at probably the negative effects of these tensions or the change of policies, you see the Biden administration has focused on friend-shoring, de-risking and denial, of course, of Chinese access to so high-end technologies. The practice, many people will accuse that of protectionism. But that probably will hurt the U.S. leadership, as the U.S. Washington stressed very much about its leadership, especially at such an occasion, I would say.
What I would say is I think that what we've really seen, that what competition has done is it's accelerated trends that had already existed. We had already been seeing China trying to move up the value chain in its production. We've been seeing costs rising in China. So really, there have been a lot of reasons for companies to be expanding their footprint outside of China as well as inside. And so COVID accelerated that, and so has competition. And so I think one of the things that companies learned, whether it was an American company or a Chinese company or a European company, was that the idea that you could have a single source of supply for key commodities or key products is something that just isn't sustainable in the long term. And so, as Wang Dan said, they have to look at options which raise costs. And that means maybe continuing with the production in China, but then adding other sources and sites of production in Southeast Asia or in the subcontinent or in Mexico. So while certainly it's been part of the Biden administration's policy to encourage the friend-shoring and onshoring, really those are the types of things that businesses have been looking to do for their own reasons because of what they went through over the last couple of years in trying to ensure supply. I think that's something that's going to be continued despite the meeting between the two leaders. That dynamic isn't going to change, and the underlying economics of those decisions aren't going to change.
Well, Shao Yuqun, an official from an APEC research arm, Carlos Kuriyama, basically told the South China Morning Post, quote, APEC economic growth is getting more stable than in previous years. We can see that economic growth has improved. There are promising signs in APEC, but it is walking a tightrope amid downside risks, basically referring to the U.S.-China tensions. So in what way, the tensions may have affected or will affect the region's economies?
I think, first of all, the intense competition or the very difficult relationship between China and the United States have already sent very negative signals to the regional economies that we have to take care of ourselves. And it's very possible that the two economies are going to decouple with each other. So what are we going to do? So this kind of a message is a lot of full of uncertainty, full of kind of a fearness for those regional countries. On the other front, the regional economies, they are trying to build multilateral mechanisms by themselves in order to avoid a kind of a situation that China and the United States, both, neither of them, are going to participate into this regional economic integration. So what we have seen is that Japan, Australia, India, all those economies and also ASEAN countries, they are trying to help themselves. So So I think it's very urgent for China and the United States, the two biggest economies, the leaders of the two biggest economies, to send clear signals that they will take responsibilities to promote the regional economic integration, and they are responsible players here in the region.
Well, you mentioned responsibility or responsible player, especially for the two largest economies, of course, not only in the region, but also around the world. Do you think they are heeding the calls or the expectations from other countries or other, especially smaller players in the rest of the world, for them probably to stabilize their relationship? Or, from another perspective, we are facing crises in Ukraine, in Gaza. Isn't this time for China and the US probably to work together to handle those more pressing challenges?
Yes, I think these are good questions. Most of the observers, the regional economies, I think up to now, they are very cautious with regard to the coming summit between President Xi and President Biden. They are just trying to wait and see to see the results. On the other side, you talk about Ukraine, about Gaza. These two conflicts are really catch all of us attention, because a lot of kind of a humanity disaster here. And as I said, China and the United States, these two countries have very different perceptions regarding the two conflicts, especially in Ukraine. And yesterday, I had some Zoom meeting with American colleagues. I think they were still worrying kind of a China-Russia alignment in the Israel-Hamas conflict. So this kind of a strategic distrust is very deep between China and the United States. But my personal view is, especially from the U.S. side, I think the two countries can do something together with regard to these two conflicts. For example, in Ukraine, the nuclear safety, the food security, those issues are the two countries they can work together. And with regard to Israel and Hamas conflict, I think no country, neither China nor the United States, would like to see the conflict become a kind of a regional conflicts. They would try to limit the negative implications for the Middle East regional security. So I think these two countries can really do something together. If they cannot cooperate, at least they can coordinate on some fronts.
At least they can coordinate. Obviously, there are advantages for them to work together. Sean, let's take a look at where we are now in terms of this bilateral relationship, especially the trade and related aspects. The ongoing trade war and the tech war that started back during the Trump administration has impacted both sides in the public and the business sectors. Where do you see this competition going? Is there an end in sight?
Well, I think the era of strategic competition is here to stay. But I can tell you what it looks like from the perspective of the business community and from the foreign investment community. Despite all of the talk about strategic competition, if we look at the amount of bilateral trade, just the total level between the United States and China today and where we were 2 years ago, there's significantly more trade between the two countries. I think it increased over a period of 2 years. It increased by about $180 billion, if I recall the statistics said by the US side. And so what I think that means is, what I think we've been seeing is that earlier in the Biden administration, I think there was a big fear on the part of China that the two economies were heading for decoupling, or that the US side wanted to decouple. What I think has been reassuring to the business community is the very clear statement by the US side by Janet Yellen that, quote, decoupling would be disaster for the two economies. So I think the two countries recognize that. But instead now where I think strategic competition is going is that on the US side, the US side realizes that there are parts of the economies that are so interdependent that you can't really decouple, and that's not in anyone's interest to. But I think so the areas where the US want to sort of build maybe more security in their own economy, they're referring to as de-risking or diversifying sources of supply. So I think that the competition is actually easing between the two countries as the areas where the US feels it wants to control trade are narrowed and are defined. And then again, from the business community, though, the business community doesn't see competition as a one-sided thing. They don't see this as just something that the U.S. is pushing on the business community. They also see similar issues coming from the Chinese side. Anytime we see Chinese government policies that favor Chinese companies over foreign companies in any sector, in government procurement, for example, or in the requirement that foreign companies need to operate with, say, a joint venture partner, then the business community sees that as the Chinese side engaging in competition with the US and with the West and with other countries. So I think both sides, have taken steps recently to ease the intensity of competition in a way that can help the economies of both countries. And I think that that's a great development. And our hope is that the meeting between the two leaders will help, even though there is, as I think other panelists have mentioned, really deep distrust between the countries. I think both countries realize that it's in their own interests to manage competition in a way that allows both economies to grow and that allows both countries to feel secure in supply and other strategic areas.
Well, Wang Dan, Sean mentioned about probably the impossibility to decouple for the two economies, and the U.S. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen spoke at a press conference that the U.S. does not want to decouple from the Chinese economy. But at the same time, from the Chinese perspective, you do see the U.S., for example, tightening investment in China, U.S. investment in China, and U.S. export restrictions of high-end technologies, including chips, etc. So, many people would have doubts about that kind of a declaration or statements. What do you make of that?
Well, the decoupling is real. So when we look at what's going on for those companies that are on the U.S. entity list, they do not have access to the latest technology, especially in the semiconductor industry. And when we look at a broader picture of China's high-tech industry, there has been a wide restriction on the talent, what kind of people can work for the Chinese high-tech company, and also on whether they could use certain chips related in AI industry and also cloud computing. So it did look like that the U.S. originally wanted to contain certain transformative technologies application in China. But at this point, to me, it looks more like they would like to reverse the technological advancement in China. Since so far, the export control is not only restricted to one or two technologies, as in chips, but quite targeted to those high-tech companies across different industries, including biotech. So I think the competition is quite real. But when it comes to decoupling all kind of trades or consumer goods, and that's unrealistic from the U.S. side. Its pharmaceutical industry, for example, heavily dependent on China. It doesn't matter how hard it tries, it can't source from somewhere else. And when it comes to green transition, the solar panel, wind turbine, it pretty much still rely on Chinese companies and China tech. So I would say this. The decoupling only happens for the high-tech industry between China and the U.S. It doesn't affect other industries in both countries. But also decoupling or de-risk do not apply to the rest of the world. China never wanted to decouple or can decouple from the rest of the world. But in high-tech with the U.S., it's a reality.
Anthony, if you look at the recent happening, for example, between the two countries, you do see frequent visits of senior level officials from both sides, and there's a lot of talk between them. Whether decoupling or de-risking, what do you see as the trend? Are we going to deeper in terms of decoupling, or are we going to reverse a little bit of the relationship? Let's say, probably to put the relationship on a firmer firmer ground, maybe even improve the relationship.
I like the way you categorize it, to decouple a little or de-risk a little. I think that's going to be the final trend. There's no question that there has been some de-risking, or some people have called it, as Wang Dan called it, decoupling, because if you look at Chinese exports to the United States, it peaked at 2.1 trillion, and now that number in the latest month is down to 1.7 trillion. I think that the impact of this meeting initially is to stabilize these figures to make sure that they do not deteriorate or go down from these levels. And hopefully, as your question implies, that over time, as both countries gain a better understanding of their true intentions and the true goals, that both countries are struggling to sustain economic growth, that these numbers will, in fact, over time, with better understanding between both countries, start to improve again and move back towards their previous peak.
Well, Anthony, you mentioned about the true intentions, from both sides. I mean, obviously, at least from the Chinese perspective, I think the U.S. has made it very clear that is to slow down the Chinese tech development, to slow down the Chinese innovation. And and against such a background, what do you expect from the Chinese side in terms of policy toward the U.S.? Because it seems very hard to resolve this. It's not a dilemma because this is a structural issue here. It's like more like a zero-sum competition. And the impact we are seeing is like, probably less people-to-people exchange, less visa issued to students or scholars for both sides.
Well, I think that on the U.S. side, the talk has been that they want to limit the technology insofar as it can help the military, but not to hurt the companies. Now, obviously, if you look at what's actually happened, it's clear that there's been a little bit of extreme behavior in this direction. My hope and expectation is that over time, as both countries start to feel more comfortable with each other, that we can, in fact, gravitate to having trade taking place more freely and only restrict the trade on both sides, from the Chinese side and the U.S. side, only if it has military implications. The problem is that when you take that position, it could easily slip into a more extreme position. And it's easy to argue that we may already be slipping in that direction. But I hope that over time, with greater understanding between both countries, realizing that they're economically interdependent over the long run, both of them cannot continue to grow on a sustainable basis unless they get along with each other, that this issue will in fact show some improvement.
Mm-hmm. Yuqun, if earlier Sean mentioned about the management of risks, management of the competition. The U.S. side, indeed, they talk a lot about managing the competition or managing the risks. So we need effective communication channels. But for the Chinese side, we stress very much about the prevention of risks. Why should we have risks in the first place? Let's do something to stop or prevent any potential of risks, either military or in other areas. Do you see there's such a difference? Probably we should engage each other in that respect to have a better understanding of each other.
Yes, I think you correctly talk about these differences. These differences between the two sides are huge. I think basically the two sides have very different strategic framework to deal with this bilateral relations. The United States calls it a strategic competition. I don't think the Chinese side agree with that definition. It's not. China doesn't want to have this so-called strategic competition with the United States. So when President Biden used the word guardrail or build the floor, all these concepts, the Chinese side don't agree with these concepts. But I agree that the two militaries, they have to talk with each other. But the important thing is, what is the principle of this dialogue? It cannot just a dialogue for dialogue's sake. We have to manage our differences. We have to really listen to the other side's concern. So when the Chinese side talk about the hollowing out of the U.S. one China policy, I think the Washington side should really listen carefully and to think about their policy. Right now, the U.S. policy try to strengthening its military relation with the Taiwan Authority is really a kind of a negative thing, a tendency or a trend. So if the United States continue to do that in the future, I think they only when they talk about guardrail, build the floor, the Chinese side just won't accept that.
You are talking about the Taiwan question here. Elon Musk the other day said that in peaceful means or military means, China will achieve national reunification with Taiwan. I mean, with the continued U.S. support, military support to Taiwan, are we seeing probably growing danger or risks between the two sides over Taiwan Island there?
I think that the central government policy so far is still peaceful reunification. It's Beijing's policy towards Taiwan, and it's very clear. It's very clear. And right now, I think the United States has learned wrong lessons from the Ukraine-Russia conflict. They tried to arm Taiwan. They tried to the so-called raise the capability of Taiwan military. It's just no way to go. And it's really sent very negative message towards Beijing, because right now it's DPP in power in Taiwan, and their party platform is still seeking Taiwan independence. So we are going to have an election in the coming January in Taiwan. So I think it's very important for the Biden administration to deal with this issue carefully.
Sean, of course, there is a presidential election in the United States. So, when it is if you listen to the rhetoric of the politicians on the campaign trail, often no one can afford to appear to be soft on China. So, how will that in any way may affect the relationship between the two sides? I mean, if we say achieve something positive out of the summit between the two leaders, will that be derailed because of the election there?
Oh, so I think that what has been accomplished between the two leaders, starting in Bali last year, is I think there was the consensus in Bali that it was in neither country's interest to allow the relationship between the two countries to become too unstable and to become too difficult and too unmanageable. And I think what we're going to see in the dialogue between the two leaders is a renewed commitment to keep stability in that relationship. Now, they're going to do that, and I think it's going to continue despite the sort of rigors and the ups and downs of the election season for one simple reason. And that's because the two leaders recognize that it's in their interest to manage the relationship well and to use the phrase that I think some of my colleagues didn't love, but to put a floor under the relationship. It means the Biden administration has invested very heavily in stabilizing the relationship, and the calculus behind that is not going to change going into the election. And I think on the Chinese side also recognizes having a relationship that is continuing to get worse is not in their interests. So I think despite what happens during the election season and in the run-up to the election, we should expect to see relative stability in the relationship because it's in both countries' interests and because both sides know it's in their interest.
Wang Dan, so briefly, relative stability with the summit and afterward?
Oh, well, the business world is watching this with a lot of anxiety, but the fact that those leaders are meeting have sent out good signals already. And on the China side, there is some friendly showing of the history 20 years ago. And we can have an expectation that at least in the next year, the bilateral relationship and collaboration in climate change and food security will increase, and that is a good news.
30 seconds, Anthony. So relative stability?
I think relative stability is going to be key for both leaders because they know that if they don't have relative stability, their economies will pay a heavy price, and none want to pay a heavy price.
Well, let's say a win-win cooperation hopefully will be out of the summit. With that, we come to the end of today's show. Many thanks to our guests. You can also find us on the CGTN app on YouTube. Thank you for being with us. See you next time.